Hey, what's up, everyone? It's Jenny Dildine, the LDS Mission Coach, and you are listening to the LDS Mission Podcast, episode number 207, Coping Strategies That Really Make a Difference. I'm Jenny, the LDS Mission Coach, and whether you're preparing to serve a mission, currently serving, a returned missionary, or a missionary mama like me, I created this podcast just for you. Are you searching for epic confidence, ready to love yourself and to learn the how of doing hard things? Then let's go. You totally already have what it takes to step powerfully into your potential and never question your purpose again. It's time to embrace yourself, embrace your mission, embrace your life, and embrace what's next. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited that you're here. Huge shout out today to all of the missionaries that are listening via Google Drive. So if you're listening on Apple or Spotify or something different like that, you may not realize that I do share my podcast on Google Drive with hundreds of missionaries, mission leaders that are serving all over the world, which is super fun that we get to do that. And I do that totally free. It's really helping tons and tons of missionaries. I get emails all the time about how this podcast really changed someone's mission or helped someone stay on the mission. I think it's just useful to sort of keep these mindset and emotional tools, front of mind as you're out there serving. With this episode today, we're going to talk about coping strategies that really make a difference. And this is kind of like a hot topic, right, when it comes to the mission, because once you get out on the mission, I think we tend to think, oh, I don't have the same coping strategies that I used to have. But as with every episode that I record, I really do try to sort of speak to all aspects of the mission. I've had people tell me so many times, like, you should just focus on one aspect of the mission and not try to cover all three aspects of the mission: preparing, currently serving, and return. But they're all so interconnected. And I find that the tools and strategies help in each stage. Now, they're applied sort of in different ways, in different situations, in different circumstances, but they work in all stages of the mission. And without question, someone who's gone through Mission Prep Plus won't have as much struggle on the mission or after the mission because they've learned how to apply a lot of these tools. And so I am here hoping that we can learn some coping strategies today that really make a difference. The other thing that I was thinking about this morning was how this podcast is kind of unique in that a lot of the stuff I speak to is from questions that I'm getting on Instagram, questions that I'm getting through in my inbox through Mission Prep Plus. So that's my Preparing Missionary program, and missionaries can email us and get email support through their entire mission. So a lot of these spark from that. A lot of these things that I'm talking about spark from also just conversations that I'm having with returned missionary clients, with one-on-one clients. And so it's kind of cool because this is like a real life resource for in the trenches things that you might experience either before the mission, during the mission, or after the mission. And so it's cool. I think that we can kind of look at some of that stuff together and see if we can create different outcomes in our lives and different experiences and become more of the creator of our mission experience from the minute that we decide that we want to serve until we come home and even far into the future. So that was just something on my mind that I think is a cool thing to recognize. And I really do appreciate you all being here and supporting the podcast and hanging out with me, because this is real life stuff that we're talking about and real life people that I'm interacting with. And when we talk about it and when we kind of come up with ideas and strategies about how to work through some of this stuff, it just changes the mission experience for everybody, actually, right? Because then you change yourself, which then changes your companion or your roommate if you're post-mission, which then changes the district or your entire apartment or your coworkers or whatever it is. And then we all up-level together. And we're more understanding of each other. We're more compassionate towards each other. And it's pretty good work to be doing. So thank you for being here. I was just kind of thinking about May and how fast May went for me and for my family. My daughter graduated from high school, and I feel like I'm just barely recovering from that, and with prom and with all of the things that are associated with graduation and seminary graduation. It's just, May just flew by. And so here we are at the beginning of summer, and we're going to talk about some coping strategies. Now, as I mentioned, this sort of concept or this idea came from a session that I had with a return missionary, and we were talking about some things. And what we started to notice was that perhaps one of her coping strategies for when she starts to feel stress or overwhelm, though it might look helpful and useful on the outside, actually is kind of preventing her from processing and allowing that stress, processing and allowing that overwhelm so that she can move through it. So I'm hoping this episode will be sort of like an inventory so that you can take account of what your coping mechanisms are, what your coping strategies are. And if we use useful and helpful coping strategies, then we will be able to, function better on the mission, function better after the mission. And here's a sort of a sneak peek, as is always the case, is you are your best coping strategy. And I do have another whole episode about coping strategies if you want to go check that one out, where we dive a little bit more into you being your best coping strategy. But today I'm hoping to take sort of an inventory because of what I noticed in this one session where it looked like a useful coping strategy, but actually ended up being something that this person was sort of using as a crutch to sort of avoid feeling emotion. Okay, so today we're talking about the difference between coping skills that help us in the moment sort of get through and coping skills and strategies that actually help you build real emotional resilience. Now, one thing I will say about emotional resilience is I think we tend to think that emotional resilience is simply that I don't experience tough emotion. The only way in this life that you're not going to experience tough emotion is if you're a robot. It's just, you are going to experience tough emotion. That doesn't matter if you're getting ready to leave, if you're on the mission, if you decide to stay home and not go on your mission, even though you have your call and you have a boyfriend, and then you decide you'd rather stay home and marry that person. That's going to require some tough emotion. The same as if you are on your mission, the same as when you're home from your mission, you are going to experience tough emotion. And so it is going to be helpful for you to start to differentiate for yourself what these different coping strategies are and which ones are useful and which ones are building more of your emotional resilience, which is not the absence of tough emotion, but actually your ability to move through an emotion, your ability to assimilate an emotion. Kind of like I was talking about, I think it was a couple weeks ago, about emotional metabolism, okay? So the first type of coping mechanism I want to talk about is a Band-Aid fix. And let's just first talk about how your body works. You have a brain, you have a nervous system, you have a soul or a spirit, right? Or where you house your spirit, which would be your body, okay? And you basically, your brain is always, and through your senses, you're always taking in this information. Now, some of these things that we take in are going to cause some kind of a stress response. So this stress response, like one of my clients, could be like overwhelm, anxiety, fear, insecurity, something like that. Okay. So what actually happens is we take in this information, your brain and your nervous system, right? We've talked about it a lot of times, is always trying to seek pleasure, avoid pain, and conserve energy. And your brain is designed to protect you. So when we get any sort of a stress response, your brain and your body and your nervous system are going to figure out how to respond to that. Now, your brain, and sometimes I call it your primitive brain or your nervous system, is very primitive because it will perceive sort of an emotional threat the same way that it perceives a physical threat. And we have that same sort of stress response that happens in our body. And I've talked about this a lot on the podcast. I have a lot of podcast episodes about this if you want to go back and listen to more. But so when we notice this stress response, what we can do is we can sort of squelch or repress or stop the stress response. And so some of our coping tools that we decide to use actually shut down the brain and the body and the nervous system to not have to deal at all. Okay? So the way I like to think about any sort of emotion, any sort of stress response, is that it is going to start small and then it's going to build, almost picture like a bell curve on a graph. It's going to build to a certain height and intensity, and then it's going to taper off. Okay. And so if you actually, it would be awesome if you could sort of picture this in your mind, right? Is this bell curve? Maybe you have a stress response, like you are going to teach a lesson for a first time in a different language, or maybe you're starting a new job after the mission. You're going to have sort of this first day on the job, you're going to have these churning emotions, right? And this is kind of stressful. Maybe I'm kind of nervous. Maybe I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, right? And that's going to start small and then it's going to start to build. And as that builds, coping strategies that are not helpful would be these Band-Aid fixes that interrupt that bell curve. It cuts off the bell curve right in the middle. And here's why that becomes problematic and why it is a Band-Aid fix and not a long-term builder of self-reliance is because we basically start to teach our brain, our nervous system, and our body that the answer to that stress response is the interruption of it. So let me give you an example. So this specific client, she is getting ready to go back to school in the fall and back to college. She's been home from her mission for a bit. And she tends to like to really plan. She tends to like to have lots of options if something goes wrong. And what we started to notice as we were talking about this and about her going back to school is that she had planned her schedule for the fall already, all of her classes. But what she was finding is she would get anxious or nervous that maybe the schedule wasn't quite right or that she was missing something, right? So here starts to build this little bit of anxiety or stress response. Like, what if something goes wrong? What if something happens? And I'm not getting this right. And then what she would do is she would look at the schedule and she would rethink it again and she'd log into her schedule online and she'd make sure. And then what she had was a step A, step B, or plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, plan E, that if she couldn't get into those classes, that she would be able to get into these other classes. And so what would happen is this bell curve of her stress response would start to rise, and that would feel so uncomfortable that she would just get on, look at her schedule, also look at her spreadsheet of all of her plan A, B, C, D, and E, and then would squelch that stress response. Okay? So what starts to happen then is we start to show our brain, our body, and our nervous system that the answer to uncomfortable emotion is looking at the schedule. Rather than what I've talked about so often on this podcast episode, and specifically the one that comes to mind again is emotional metabolism that I talked about a few weeks ago, rather than just processing and allowing that emotion. So let me give you a couple more examples. Let's say you are at a social gathering, right? And this is why I think phones have become problematic, not necessarily because of the comparison, although that can be part of it. But what phones do is they are a coping skill that we use, a Band-Aid fix, that when we start to feel that discomfort of going to a party and we feel a little of that social anxiety, or it feels uncomfortable when someone walks into the room that we feel like has thoughts or ideas about us or judges us, then we just go to our phone, okay? And what that does is that bell curve, it just cuts it off. And then again, what we learn, what our brain and our body and our nervous system learn, is that the answer to feeling that discomfort or that insecurity or that overwhelm or that anxiety or that nervousness or that fear is the phone. When actually that is a Band-Aid fix. And we're going to talk about in just a minute how it's okay also to use Band-Aid fixes sometimes, but know that the more we train our brain and our nervous system and our body to just squelch the feeling, have the feeling, avoid the feeling and have it go away by looking at our phones or by checking our schedules, right? Or scrolling on Facebook, or scrolling on Reels or TikTok or whatever, that it might reduce those symptoms for a minute, but it actually doesn't discharge the stress. It doesn't complete the stress response cycle, okay? And so think about a stress response cycle as like that bell curve that I'm talking about. And then we come back to sort of a normal sort of level where everything's okay. Like, let me think of an example. So maybe I'm driving and there's a close call. Someone like almost comes into my lane, or right? And then that stress builds, and then maybe I'm feeling a little sweaty. My heart's a little racy. My body is a little on edge. I'm on high alert, right? But then eventually that stress response cycle kind of dies down and then comes back to normal. And sometimes it takes longer than other times. But that is the goal, to allow our bodies, our brains, and our nervous system to move all the way through that. Let me give you a few ideas, other ideas of what this might look like. Could be over planning, avoiding emotion with productivity, right? I'm just going to get really busy and I'm going to start over functioning. It could look like perfectionism, where I'm going to try to do all of these perfect things perfectly well and perfectly, quote unquote, right, so that I don't have to feel. And again, I want us to understand that even some of the things that can look like really helpful and sort of benign on the surface can maybe also just be a Band-Aid fix. And nothing wrong with Band-Aid fixes, for sure. And we're going to talk about that. But let's talk about some of the things that we can do coping strategies that we can use that actually help us complete a stress response cycle. Okay, so a lot of times it's exercise and movement. Have you ever noticed a dog and how when he wakes up from a nap or something like that, that he stretches, he shakes his body? Or also, we have a swimming pool and sometimes we get ducks in the swimming pool. We'll send my dog Graham out to chase the ducks out of the pool. And then he comes back in, prances back in, and then he shakes it all off. That sort of heightened response, he shakes it out. And so think of a useful coping strategy that can really make a difference is physical exercise and movement. So it could be running, swimming, dancing, like doing any sort of deep breaths or laughing. It can be just even like shaking your hands out, or doing some jumping jacks or something like that. Also, maybe an emotional sort of response that you have. It can be helpful to process that and cope by having some social interaction, by some crying. I've done a lot of crying this last month, just processing my daughter leaving and the dynamics changing in our house and things like that. It can be creativity. I love this one so much, is that when we're creative, and this can be creative in any way, just looking at the clouds and picturing the different shapes in the clouds, or it can be creative storytelling, or it can be creative writing, or it can be not always necessarily stuff that we would think of in the arts. It doesn't have to be singing or music or pottery. It can actually be like creating a spreadsheet or creating a plan for your day. Those things can also help. Drawing. I've loved how you see a lot of times people with the Book of Mormons now that are painting the front of those Book of Mormons. I think so cool to do stuff like that. So when we think about coping strategies in the spiritual realm, that we can have prayer and stillness, and we can have like what am I trying to say? A recentering in the scriptures, but that's not just for a checkoff reason. We go looking for inspiration or for guidance. And then we can also use coping strategies, which is a lot of what I talk about on here, which would be like cognitive tools, where we name our emotions, we actually process those emotions, and we can reframe our thoughts, which brings us to a lot of the thought work stuff that we do here. We can do that in words or pictures. We can dream about the future, about what we want in the future. There's just so many ways to complete the stress response cycle. And here are the questions I want you to ask yourself. And again, I want to circle back to this example, though, of the client who was obsessively kind of looking at her schedule to squelch that bell curve. A lot of the things I even mentioned could be used, again, to just like interrupt that emotional wave. And so just because it looks like a healthy, quote unquote, sort of way to process or allow that stress response cycle to complete, just because it looks that way on the outside and it looks pretty benign, doesn't mean that it's going to actually help you move through that and become more emotionally resilient. So here's some questions, some inventory you could take to sort of ask yourself. Number 1, does this coping strategy seem to be out of my power or almost compulsive? I really like this one, because if you feel the emotions kind of building within you, is your coping mechanism compulsive? Almost like you're just drawn to it and it's out of your power. Like almost like the strategy itself has more power than you do. Like you're just drawn to it compulsively. Okay. And I think the word compulsive has kind of a negative connotation. I don't mean it that way, but just like in a, again, just in a way that you don't feel like you have the power, that I just check the schedule. I just check the schedule. I just check the schedule. And it almost feels like you can't not do it. Okay. Number 2, am I making an intentional choice as I use this coping strategy? So I think this is a good indicator. Am I like consciously saying to myself, okay, I can see this is the coping strategy I want to use. I am going to go for a run and it's going to help me process this. I am going to have a good cry and that's going to help me process this. Or does it again feel like it's not intentional? Number 3, do I use this strategy to squelch discomfort or to process the discomfort? I was just thinking that the word squelch is a funny word. I've used it a lot of times in this episode. So, do you think we could find squelch in the dictionary? Anyway, you get the point. Are we interrupting that bell curve to just stop emotion, prevent us from feeling, or are we using that thought work or that prayer or that stillness or that crying or the dancing or the running to help us complete that bell curve and come back to a more even place? Okay, I think this is really a good inventory as well. Am I capable of feeling this emotion even if the coping strategy is not available? Right? This is kind of the hot topic on the mission, is like all of the quote unquote coping strategies that we use before the mission, we don't necessarily have on the mission. So this is why it's so important for you to understand if you're capable of feeling anxiety, if you're capable of feeling that insecurity and that nervousness and that overwhelm or that pressure without an escape. Okay, that's a really good question to ask yourself. Like, for instance, with this example I've used with my client, is she able to feel that overwhelm, allow herself to move through the overwhelm without looking at the schedule? I think that's a really important indicator. And then, does this strategy help me escape emotion or get more present? And this is one of the concepts that I think about, is when we feel uncomfortable emotion, what we want to do is we want to escape out of our body. It's like that emotion is so uncomfortable that we want to get away from it. The analogy I like to think of is if I'm in a swimming pool and anxiety comes along, I just want to get out of the pool as fast as possible. We want to get out of our body. And what we want to do instead is we want to get more present with that emotion. So I hope this has given you some things to think about. And the last thing I want to say is I don't want you to think about this in such a black or white way, that if you're able to process the emotion, it's good. If it's a Band-Aid fix, it's bad. Listen, sometimes you're just going to want to use a Band-Aid fix. And as a full-grown adult, you get to decide when to do that. You get to decide when you just want to get on your phone or when you want to just look at the schedule because you're not up for processing and allowing the emotion in that moment. And I think this is where we can step into true freedom as emotional adults, is when we don't see either option as good or bad. That there's no such thing as a bad sort of coping strategy, that it's something that we just get to choose. And sometimes I'm going to shake it off and process my emotion. And sometimes I'm going to actually just get on Netflix because I'm not ready to think about it or deal with it. And that's a Band-Aid fix, because guess what's going to happen is that emotion's going to be there when I get back. It just will. It'll still be there because I haven't completed the stress response cycle. Okay. And so you, as an adult, I want you to see yourself as fully empowered to make these decisions for yourself. When are you intentionally squelching? And you totally can. It's totally fine that you do sometimes. But when you're ready, and if you want to expand your capacity to feel and to move through these stress response cycles, that is also available to you. Because I will say it over and over, and I used to say it, I think, a lot more on earlier podcast episodes, but confidence is being willing to feel any emotion. Because listen, if you are willing to feel any emotion, if you could ride every stress response cycle that ever pops up, guess what you could do? You could do anything. You could do anything if you can ride the stress response cycle. Okay? So I hope this helps you. You, again, are your best coping strategy. You've got Band-Aid fixes. Totally fine. Use them if you need to, but become super aware and use this inventory of questions to figure out where you're at with your different coping strategies. Does the coping strategy seem to be out of my power? Like the strategy has the power and not me? Am I making intentional choices as I use this coping strategy? Do I use this strategy to squelch discomfort or to process it? Am I capable of feeling this emotion if the coping strategy is not available? And does this strategy help me escape emotion or get more present? Okay? And then remember, you are an adult and you get to decide when you want to use any of these coping strategies or a Band-Aid fix. Totally up to you. Okay, I hope you have the most amazing week, and we'll talk to you next time. Serving a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints can present a unique set of challenges, and mindset and emotional well-being is more important than ever. So thanks for being a part of this community, where we share real-life mission stories, support each other through struggles, and keep creating the mission and post-mission experiences that we truly want. Don't forget to check out the show notes for additional resources and share this episode with someone that you think might need it. Thanks so much for being a part of my world, and know this: no matter which part of the mission experience you are involved in, Jenny, the LDS mission coach, is thinking about you every single day.